Today's episode brings three unbelievable encounters, starting with what a listener saw in Alaska in the middle of the night, something that made them lose hours of their memory, and then on to Berkeley County, West Virginia, and what was found ransacking a hunting cabin. Finally, off to the southeastern part of the United States, where a listener's uncle spills the beans on what he saw in a national government laboratory. Ready? Let's get into the stories. Hi, Lilith. I don't share this story often, but here you go. I was born and raised in Alaska. The older I get, the more I realize how great it was to have the childhood that I did. Growing up in a small town off the road system was amazing. Our parents made sure we took advantage of all the opportunities that were available. We got used to being outside all the time as kids. We would camp, hunt, fish when we were really young. But by the time I was an older teenager, I was just about fully independent. My parents trusted me to be out and about alone quite often. The town I lived in, as long as it was a clear night, was very normal to see all sorts of strange lights in the sky. The winter is long up here, and I spent a lot of time under those stars. It was incredibly beautiful for anyone who didn't mind the cold too much. Sometimes I would drive a snowmobile a few miles out of town and just lay in the snow looking up at the sky. The northern lights were also a pretty common sight. It wasn't something that happened every day, but often enough that people up there were pretty used to it. Now that I live in the lower states, I realize how many people would just love to see them. But up there, they started seeming ordinary after a while. So on this one night, I had a lot on my mind and I couldn't sleep. I decided to go out on one of my midnight drives. I didn't tell my parents, and they were probably asleep anyway, but I knew they wouldn't mind. I took the snowmobile and I drove a few miles over the hills. I wanted to find a spot without any light pollution from the town. There, I shut off the engine and settled into a good spot to look up and have some good time thinking. I was in a relationship that was kind of driving me crazy, and I was trying to decide what to do about it. So at first, it was just the usual scene. I watched a few satellites passing over here and there. I picked out the constellations that I knew. But after a while, I started noticing a clicking sound. At first, I thought it was the sound of the snowmobile cooling down, like the engine expanding and contracting in the cold. But then I realized that the sound definitely wasn't coming from that direction. I sat up and I looked around, thinking maybe there was some animal nearby. I was prepared to get out of there fast, just in case. I didn't want to be dealing with a wild animal in the middle of the night, but I thought that the clicking sounded way too regular for it to be coming from an animal anyway. Also, it was pretty mechanical sounding. The more I listened, the more I realized that the sound seemed to be coming from above and in front of me. I was staring upward and just seeing what I usually saw. Stars, some northern light action, a satellite crossing the sky, all normal things. After a while, I was getting too cold and was about ready to head home. But I noticed that something looked odd in the aurora borealis. There were these three super bright points of light. At first, I thought they were stars, but they were too perfectly placed. And they were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring and watching them, continuing to get brighter and brighter. At this point, I swore the clicking noise was getting louder and louder too. And then it just stopped. And the lights were gone, and the clicking wasn't there, and everything actually sounded extra quiet. I was getting pretty stiff and cold and maybe slightly spooked. So I got up to leave, but then all of a sudden, this bright three-orbed object was hovering above me, much closer now than those three lights had been, and the clicking was loud. It was triangle-shaped with one light orb on top and two underneath, all simultaneously moving together. I bet 10 to 20 seconds passed, but it felt like an hour. And then all of a sudden it went from hovering to hitting warp speed in the blink of an eye, and it shot off into the horizon and disappeared. I jumped on the snowmobile, and don't you know, it was taking longer than usual to start up. I was starting to worry, but then quickly it started running, so I headed back to my house. My mind was full of speculation, wondering if what I saw was some kind of weird behavior of the northern lights that I had never heard about. I pulled up to my house thinking I had to get inside and get to bed without waking everybody up, but then I saw that the windows were all lit up, which was really strange. and I'm now wondering why my parents would be up at 2 o'clock in the morning. I had left around midnight and was gone about 2 hours. I went into the house and my mom was awake and standing in the kitchen making coffee. I looked at the clock. It said 6 a.m. I just stared at the clock, not understanding. And then I realized I must have been out there staring at those clicking lights for like 6 hours. There was no way. But I sure couldn't argue with the time. I ended up telling my mom and dad the whole story, and they were just blown away by it all. But they're the kind of parents who know me well and know that I wouldn't make stuff like that up. I never even ended up going to bed at all that day. That was one of the most amazing things that has ever happened to me, and I have yet to see it again. So who knows what it was? I have a story for you from my home in West Virginia. I live in a city in the north of West Virginia called Fairmont, but this happened at my buddy's hunting cabin in Berkeley County. Berkeley County is one of the easternmost counties of West Virginia, and it sits at the top of the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is part of the Appalachian Trail. The trail's a hiker's paradise. It goes down the Blue Ridge Mountains, and it's truly a beautiful area. My buddy has a hunting cabin that's pretty remote in this area. I believe it was family land handed down. He rarely goes, and the cabin hadn't been used at that time for a few seasons. So when my buddy suggested that we take a long weekend to be mountain men, what we call hunting, fishing, and roughing it, I was all in. We packed light because the cabin does have some of the necessities, like running water. The trip into the cabin was great, the views truly unmatched. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon and settled in for the night. Everything in the cabin seemed to be in order as we quickly glanced about, besides finding a snake in the woodpile. The afternoon was relatively uneventful. We were pretty beat and we went to sleep around dark, so it was probably 9 p.m. Then near 1 in the morning, something made a noise outside of my room. It startled me awake. It sounded like something had fallen. Knowing that the cabin hadn't been in use and most likely wild animals had become comfortable coming close, I thought it was most likely a deer or raccoon. It was probably helping itself to our McDonald's bags that we had left on the bench outside the door. I must have drifted off to sleep because I was then startled awake again about 1:45 in the morning. This time there was a loud boom. My buddy had woken up too, and he was on the other side of the cabin. Both of us quickly grabbed our guns and a flashlight, and we tried at first to peer out the little front window in the cabin. But due to it being small and unclean, it was impossible to really see out. We then decided to creep out and see what had caused the commotion. As we slowly and quietly slid out the front door, we saw that the heavy wooden bench that sat out front had been tossed upside down about 5 feet away. The area is known to have bears and wild boar. The bears can be quite large, and the boar are just stupid destructive. Yet, not a single creature was in sight. It was late, and I was on edge, so we decided it would just be best to hunker down for the night. The original plan was that we would get up super early Friday morning to hunt, but after the night we had, it was decided we would not go out until after daylight. At daylight, we began poking around outside. We didn't notice at first, but then we realized that there were faint tracks all around the cabin. The tracks were odd. The creature was for sure not a bear or a wild boar. This thing had a foot span longer than that of a typical man's. We measured it at about 14 inches long. It favored the outside of its feet, so a width measurement was impossible to get accurately. I wear a size 12 shoe, and it was easily wider and longer. The creature seemed to have toes or something that splayed more like fingers. I couldn't figure out if it was walking on 2 feet or 4. It seemed to switch back and forth. At this point, I was Googling everything I could, trying to determine what types of wildlife are in the area we're in, and figure out if we should be more scared than we were. During my wild Google session, my buddy had decided to start breakfast. He had brought a grill for us to cook on, so he went to the truck to dig it out. Well, this quickly turned into some frantic hollering. During the night, whatever had flipped the bench had obviously helped itself to most of the supplies in the back of the truck, too. The grill was still there, most likely due to it not being super portable. But our extra hunting gear had been taken. Our cooler was gone, and so were several of the knives. Luckily, we had brought all of the guns inside when we arrived. We also had begun to entertain the idea that maybe some druggy mountain people had stumbled upon us last night. It didn't really explain the bench, but it did explain the stealing. We then had a decision to make. We could try to salvage what we could and stay until Sunday, the original plan, or we could take off. I was ready to leave, but I didn't want to admit it. My buddy still wanted to stay and do some exploring. I think he was sore about having been stolen from, and was hoping to come across his stuff. After breakfast, we decided to do some scouting, so we took off on foot with our hunting rifles. We'd probably walked about 15 minutes when we approached the creek that borders one side of his property. We were ready to follow the creek for a bit when I spotted something orange across it. So we waded through a narrow part of the channel and found that the orange item was my hunting safety vest. Even while wearing camo, we usually wear something bright to stay safe from a stray bullet being sent by a hunting partner. It looked like it had been dropped. And at this point, my buddy wanted to continue in the direction the vest was left to see if we could find the thieves. I suggested we call the police, but he laughed at the idea and said that the police would never make the trek out this far to recover hunting supplies. He was probably right, but later we learned it was for a different reason. We continued on, and at this point, I was spooked. Every time a squirrel scurried by, I'm ready to run, and then my friend pointed out a cave. Not like the little holes I always imagined caves to be, but a huge open-mouth cave. My buddy is all pointing and trying to whisper that the druggies might be hiding in there. And then something happened. A large creature, hunkering like a bear, moved to the mouth of the cave. It was on all fours, but its back was angled high, like a feline, and was covered in shaggy fur like a sheepdog would have. It was brownish black. I couldn't see its face, only its back and a little bit of its side. At this point, the creature slowly started to rise, and it kept rising, slowly lifting its large, heavy body. I was a good distance away, but it was easily over 7 feet tall. It didn't have clothing on, only shaggy hair and fur. I stood completely still, afraid to move or even breathe. The creature stealthily moved into the cave. At this point, I'm done. No amount of convincing would have kept me hanging around. It glanced at my buddy, and he was the same. So as quietly as possible, we moved back toward the creek. We crossed, and then we ran back to the cabin. Without saying a word, we packed up our stuff and took off. It was probably 10 minutes up the road that we finally began to really speak. We decided to stop by the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office was a laid-back place. Funny enough, it even had coffee and donuts sitting out on the counter when we went in. We asked to speak to somebody in private about some items being stolen. I think we were obviously scared of what we would say when we began to speak. The receptionist walked us back to a small office. Sitting at the desk was an officer, and he asked what he could help us with. I finally worked up the nerve and explained that we had been at a hunting cabin on the North Rim, and that we had been woken in the night to some items being stolen from our vehicle. He asked for a more specific location, and when we gave him a closer address, he began to smirk. He asked what we did after the items were stolen. We described our morning. When I told him then about the creature, he did put on a more serious face. He said, "You two are lucky. We have a bandit of sorts on that mountain. Most see evidence of him passing through, but very few have been able to catch a glimpse. Gentlemen, thank you for your time in Berkeley County. Have a safe trip home." Needless to say, the cabin has now officially been abandoned. My buddy hasn't been back, and as far as I know, no one else has either. It's a story we like to tell to friends, but they always chalk it up to drunk hunting. But I know what I saw, and there is a giant creature in that cave, not far from an abandoned hunting cabin. Thank you, Carl. I have a story for you. I'd rather not say exactly where I live, but it's in the southeastern part of the United States, near a national government laboratory. Many of the employees at the laboratory are not allowed to talk about the projects they're working on outside of work. However, it's not uncommon to corner an uncle or a friend that's employed there and try to weasel some information out of them. They will sometimes drop tidbits or tell crazy things that aren't classified. One night after an uncle of mine had a few too many drinks, he started talking about this creature that they kept at the lab. He described it as stickly, thin, bone-like, and bald. He said its eyes were too big for its head and its hands and feet had long, bony appendages. He said he had seen it deep in an underground bunker located under the lab. My uncle was an architectural engineer. He had been called in to determine the structural integrity of the bunker. According to him, the government had built the shelter during World War II, and whatever was being kept there was breaking it down. My uncle had been led deep into the complex and down several tunnels until he arrived at the bunker. He said the bunker resembled a bank vault, like those from the old bank heist movies. He said that the escorts had instructed him not to look at the back of the structure, just the interior section tied to the hallway. At first, he said nothing stood out, but then he looked up and saw evidence that something dangerous was being kept inside the bunker. He said there were claw marks deep into the walls, and he was baffled because the bunker was made of thick steel and concrete. He said it would be impossible for a human or wild animal to leave those marks on the walls. After examining the front walls, he said aloud that they should still hold for several years. At his prognosis, he said he heard a terrible sound come from the back of the bunker, and it sounded like a wail and a high-pitched screech all in one. Without thinking, he quickly turned and peered into the back, and it was then that he spotted the creature. He said it was restrained in a seated position, so he couldn't tell its full height or size. He said that the guards quickly rushed him from the room and had more guards posted in front of the bunker. One guard escorted him back to the surface level and out the tunnels. The guard took him into an office and they repeatedly asked him questions about what he had seen. He said he knew better than to admit anything, so he kept repeating that it was dark and he only saw the front of the room. Now the laboratory is surrounded by acres and acres of woods. Armed guards patrol the perimeter and signs are posted everywhere that it's a violation to cross the boundary. And many employees have told me that snipers are scattered throughout to stop intruders. Hunters occasionally drift near the perimeter, but nobody crosses it. However, on one side of the lab is a rural highway, and it goes directly along the side of the border. It's a narrow 2-lane road that locals only use to reduce commute time. So I was on this road late one night, and I saw some strange lights floating above the road directly ahead. As my car approached, the lights seemed to be the same distance ahead. I began to have these wild ideas, but then I quickly smashed them for the thought of, someone has a drone. Yeah, some kid has a new birthday present. And then the lights started to speed up and move from side to side. I wasn't sure of what to think at this point. The next thing I know, the lights did a wild swirl and then nosedived into the woods up ahead to my left. And then next, as if they had been following or chasing this object, a surge of lab police vehicles swarmed the wooded area. They didn't seem to notice me and my little black Civic in all of the commotion. I heard the worst noise when I came to the closest spot on the road to where the lights crashed. It was a screeching wail. My windows were up and the noise was still off the charts. I pushed my foot to the gas, quickly passed the commotion, and then made it off the remote road. For weeks, I watched the local news and I listened for any indication that something had happened on that remote road. Yet, nothing was ever said. In my mind, that noise came from a creature like the one my uncle had seen trapped in the bunker years ago. I don't know if it was the same creature or its companions that had come to rescue it, but I went from being a skeptic to a believer. Thanks, Lynn. Let me know what you think about these stories in the comments below. And don't forget to check out Donovan Dread, who releases almost every single day. Also, if you like true crime, then check out Donovan Dread True Crime. There are new releases several times a week.